The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM-LP at 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions, comments, or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any content. If you care to, you can send us letters at our new address, which is The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week we're very pleased to share a presentation done some months ago at Firestorm Books by journalist and writer Charles Cobb. Cobb has had a long career of landmark moments, for example, being the first Africa correspondent for NPR and being the first black staff writer for National Geographic Magazine, among other achievements. In this presentation, done on April 2nd, 2018, Cobb talks about his 2014 book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, which details his work from 1962 to 1967 for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the most influential youth and student organization during the civil rights movement. He also fills in a much overlooked gap in the understanding of the civil rights movement, including the lived experiences of black people in the rural South at the time, giving his insights on embedding in communities for social justice purposes, and drawing lessons from those insights as they pertain to the current movement for black lives. In this talk, he's being interviewed by Carol, who is a longtime comrade and friend. Charles Cobb is currently a senior analyst at allafrica.com, which self-describes as being, quote, a voice of, by, and about Africa, aggregating, producing, and distributing news and information from over 140 African news organizations and our own reporters to an African and global public, unquote. Stay tuned till the end of the episode for some announcements.
Thank you for making the space available. We're very grateful. Briefly, Charlie and I have known each other, it turns out, for about 55 years. I saw that look. We were both on the staff of an organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Charlie, like a number of the young people who became part of the SNCC staff, left school, in Charlie's case, after his first year at Howard, never to return. And I've always wanted to ask Charlie, and it seems like a good beginning point of this conversation, about you left school, your family was supportive of that education, and why did you do that? How did you choose at that point, Charlie, to become involved in that emerging movement?
Well, in a sense, I think we were caught up we being young people like myself, were caught up in the currents of the time. It was a time of tremendous ferment and change, and you don't have nearly enough time to point to the various elements that I think were generating that change. I talk about some of them that I think are important, at least insofar as the black community is concerned, in the book. For instance, World War II veterans and what they brought back after having fought fascism overseas. And it's also part of their inclination to use guns in defending their communities, seeking a democracy that they didn't have here in the United States. Things like the changes wrought by the surge of independence movements in Africa, Asia. There are a range of things that I don't have to change. The point is that there the currents of change were flowing, and of course it's affecting people like me. And the specific trigger there were two kind of related but specific triggers. If you ask anybody my age or my generation what had the biggest impact on them as a young person, it would be the murder of Emmett Till in 1955 in Mississippi. And we were almost everybody I knew growing up, and of course, and I hear the same thing in conversations with people who would become a part of SNCC or CORE for that matter, can remember standing on the street corner or somewhere looking at the double truck photograph in the Jet magazine of Emmett Till's body and talking about how it did two things. I mean, it reinforced a negative image of Mississippi that we had long held because of our parents and grandparents, but it also begins our thinking about the necessity for struggle and change. I mean, I would have to put Emmett Till more than the Supreme Court decision, more than the Montgomery bus boycott. It was Emmett Till's murder. That's a specific trigger. And we're roughly the same age as Emmett Till, 14 years old, 15 years old. Then for me, making this personal, though this is really reflective of what happened to SNCC, the sit-ins erupt here in North Carolina, right up the road in Greensboro, in 1960, February 1. Now I was in high school when the sit-ins erupted. Those 4 students sit in at the Woolworths, I think, in Greensboro, and they spread like wildfire right across the South, some 80 southern cities within a 2-month period, which would lead to the formation of SNCC. But what the sit-ins did was, for the first time, we saw people our own age engaged in struggle for change. If you think about civil rights back then, I think for most of us of my generation, civil rights was something grown-ups did. Not something you may know about it. You may even be a part of an NAACP youth chapter because your parents or aunts and uncles signed you up. But really, it's the sit-ins that really tells you, oh, well, this is something I could do. And as a 12th grader, the way that's reaching me is via television and newspaper. So I'm looking at black students, and if you were black in 1960 and in college, the odds were overwhelming that you were a student at an HBCU, a historically black college and university. And if you were a student at an HBCU, you were in the South, with a handful of exceptions, Lincoln in Pennsylvania, Wilberforce in Central State in Ohio, maybe a couple other schools. But by and large, and if you were planning to go to college, or if your parents were planning for you to go to college, the odds were you would be going to an HBCU, so you would be confronted with what you're looking at or reading about. You're looking at Diane Nash or John Lewis or a range of people, Julian Bond or Lonnie. I could tick off a whole list of names, some of which you might be familiar with, a lot of which you wouldn't. But you're looking at people more or less your own age, because there's not a big difference between me as a 12th grader and Diane as a sophomore in college, or something like that. So you were going to be confronted with what they were confronted with. So the question is, what are you going to do when you're confronted with that? And the answer that the young people, the students, were presenting to you, really a challenge, was attack it directly with the sit-ins. It's not very different from the response of the young people who form now the Movement for Black Lives to both specifically the murder of Trayvon Martin and the broader issue of police violence against young black. It's not a big difference, although the times are certainly very different. So that's what happened. I go to Howard University, and everything around Washington and this is 1961 now, is segregated. And Washington, D.C. itself had only recently begun to desegregate. Washington doesn't begin to desegregate until the middle 1950s. But everything around it in Maryland and Virginia was racially segregated. So there was a whole sit-in movement that was coming off the Howard University campus at HBC. And this is where I first encountered Stokely, Carmichael, and a whole range of people, because we're all classmates. And I become involved and make a compress, a fairly lengthy story. Because I was involved in the sit-ins, I become aware of SNCC. SNCC had formed as the students were sitting in 1960. Ella Baker, one of the great figures of 20th century social change, then the executive director of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, recognized the importance of these sit-ins. And she got $800 from Martin Luther King's group to bring the students together for a conference at her alma mater. Now, King gave the money because he wanted a student wing of his organization. And he saw the student senators as the way to that. Miss Baker, when that conference happened, was going around saying, well, maybe you want to think about forming your own organization. I say Miss Baker because she was 57 years old when she did that. And there was no way I was then 18 years old, there was no way that Ella Baker was going to be Ella. And so she was the one saying, think about forming, and out of that emerged SNCC. Now, I was sort of vaguely aware of this as a sit-in student in 1961, but hadn't thought seriously about involvement with SNCC. But then CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and I'm slowly coming up to a point that's important. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, invited me to a workshop for student activists in Houston, Texas. And they gave me money for a bus ticket because you didn't fly to places back then. And I took this bus trip from Washington, D.C., all the way through the South. Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Houston. That's what my ticket said. And I got off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi, because the students were sitting in. If you remember, I told you that Emmett Till is really central to our thinking. And I felt it was one thing for me to be sitting in Virginia or Maryland. It was something qualitatively different for the students to be sitting in Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered. So I wanted to meet them, just in case they had some kind of gene that I didn't have. So I made my way to their headquarters and told them what I'm telling you. I'm on the way to Texas for this workshop. And one of these students who was in the room, Lawrence Guillot, then just graduated from Tougaloo College and who would later become chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Great big guy, you will remember, Carol. Got up off his seat and he hovers over me with complete disdain. And I remember his words exactly after all these years. He said, "You're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights? What's the point of doing that when you're standing right here in Mississippi?" And I kind of got the message, and it was a challenge, really. If they were getting ready, Guillot and some were getting ready to begin a campaign for voting rights in the Mississippi Delta, cotton country. And it was summertime, so I felt I didn't have to go to Texas. I could stay in Mississippi and see what these people were doing up there. It had not occurred to me before Guillot had flung this rather disdainful and maybe a little bit bullying challenge at me. About the idea hadn't occurred to me about staying in Mississippi. And so I did. I went up to the Delta that summer. And what I didn't realize was that once you do something like that, you can't just tell people who are working with you. You can't just tell people when the summer ends, well, it's been interesting. I've got to register for school. I mean, people have put their lives at risk, and their livelihoods at risk if they are supporting you at any level. So you have to choose. I mean, because the biggest fear of people back then was not so much the violence, and Mississippi was extremely violent, that was that you'd start something, they'd become involved with it, and then you could do the one thing that they couldn't do, leave. Mm-hmm. And so, and it didn't take long to pick up on that concern, especially if you're like me. I'm coming from Washington, D.C. There was nothing that obligated me to stay in Mississippi. The people we're working with, generally people the ages of our parents and grandparents, though, they're locked into that state. They don't have the choice so I stayed for roughly 5 years. And SNCC was just beginning its work in Mississippi, so it was the natural organization for somebody. I was now 19 years old. It was the natural organization to gravitate toward if I wanted to stay and do the kind of work that I thought was important to do. And I did. I stayed until 1967. I mean, that's sort of the short version of a very complicated. The thing to understand about this story, though, I'll say, is that as important as the movement's challenges to white supremacy were, and as important as the challenges to racism were, I would argue that more important, if you really want to understand the movement and the grassroots dynamic that drove it, then you have to understand the challenges that black people made to one another within the black community. Because that's what Guyot was doing to me. I mean, it didn't involve whites at all. I mean, Guyot is basically saying, if you're serious, then why are you going off to chatter about civil rights somewhere in Texas? We're getting ready to do stuff here. What are you going to do? Which is the same challenge I was getting from the sit-ins, looking at them on television. You're going to be where we are at an HBCU. You're going to be confronted with the same thing we're confronted with. What are you going to do? Challenge. And in terms of my specific involvement, I tell the Mississippians all the time, y'all kidnapped me. But in terms of me specifically, it was the challenge by Lawrence Guyot getting up off his seat after I finished talking about going to Texas that resulted in me, one, becoming a part of SNCC's beginning efforts in Mississippi and staying in that state as a SNCC field secretary for all those years. And that was the short version, too.
So the choice specifically, you talked about the decision, and we each had our individual decisions, what spurred us to get into the movement. The decision specifically in more detail about SNCC, because there was an NAACP in Mississippi. Why SNCC? What about the way SNCC eventually reoperated that compelled you to be part of that particular organization, and how you reflect on that at this point?
Well, it relates to Mississippi and the Mississippians. And you have to understand, without going into great detail, the general attitude of the so-called national civil rights organizations were that you avoided Mississippi. It's too dangerous. You don't get enough result for the kind of effort you're putting. This was Medgar Evers' problem with his national headquarters in New York. Medgar Evers of the NAACP. CORE didn't have much of a presence in Mississippi at this point in early 1960, and SCLC didn't have a presence in Mississippi. So in some ways, the only option you had, if you wanted to stay, was SNCC. And that's where, as a consequence, a lot of young people who might have at one point have become members of the NAACP youth chapters, which did exist because Megger organized them, or tried to organize them. That's why a lot of the young people interested in struggle, in civil rights struggle in particular, gravitated towards SNCC. I mean, the other factors, young people in Mississippi liked if you went into Mississippi back in those days and went in some little town, the word, especially among the young people, was that freedom riders had come to town. And it was a romanticized notion about who you were, or they knew something about the sentence. They liked the idea. Really, if you were young, you symbolized, as a young person, somebody who was bold enough to directly challenge these white supremacists. And immediately when you came to town, and most of the time we were brought to town by some older person, it was the young people who emerged wanting to talk to you almost right away, in a matter of a day or two in these little towns. So most of the people in Mississippi working in the movement were native Mississippians. They weren't like me. They weren't from outside the state. You know, Bob Moses was, and Frank Smith from Georgia was. That was it. Frank, myself, and Bob. Everybody else. And how did those young people emerge? First, Bob came to Mississippi, again working down in Macomb. Then I showed up, and the first core group were the young people wanting to hang out with the freedom riders. and you could, there's a whole story about the influence of Ella Baker and how she taught us how to organize at the grassroots and taught us the importance of organizing at the grassroots. And we were able to move sort of from protest, because in Mississippi in those days, once you got outside the capital city, there weren't that many places to protest in the first place, unless you were going to protest at a gas station or a cotton gin. So it was fairly easy movement from protest into community organizing at the grassroots. And we were able to, because with young people, or people our own age, able to enter in right away with conversations about community organizing at the grassroots in much the same way that Ella Baker had engaged us in conversation. In fact, we were more or less repeating Ella Baker's lines in talking to our own age group about the importance of organizing at the grassroots. And then there was a whole set of people, some of which I talk about in the book, who had, before we were even born, been organizing at the grass in different. You know, there were 35 Marcus Garvey chapters in Mississippi in the 1920s. You know, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And there was a whole level. It was invisible until you were actually there. But there was a whole level of organization. People, as I said, the age of our grandparents and parents who had been out there, World War II veterans, in a few instances World War I veterans, and against enormous odds. And those were the people who took us in, and in fact, what led to the book. Those are the people with the guns. Because the one thing they said, the movement was defined by the media as this nonviolent movement. Because we had two names were attached to us as SNCC. Yeah, we were either freedom riders, because the freedom ride bus had come through Mississippi, or we were the nonviolence. That's how people saw us. They would say one or the other. These nonviolents have come to town, or the freedom riders have come to town. And the attitude of the grown-ups in these communities where we were working was, well, you may be nonviolent, but I'm not letting these white people kill you. They made it perfectly plain about that. And, partly in terms of age, like I said, I was 19 when I first went to Mississippi, and the people who are speaking like that are older. So I wasn't in a position to challenge them. And partly because, really, with the exception of maybe the Nashville group, most of us weren't particularly committed to nonviolence beyond using it as a tactic in certain instances, like sit-ins or freedom rides. Otherwise, we didn't have a huge problem with these grown-ups who would say, I'll tell you one quick story, then I'll read you something from the book. I worked in a county, Issaquah County. It's basically one enormous cotton patch, and one town in the county. And the leader of the movement there was a woman named Unita Blackwell. And she's very strong and fascinating woman. But I noticed her husband had never come to the courthouse to try and register to vote as his wife. And so I asked him one day, well, are you going to try and register to vote? And he paused for a minute and he said, well, Charlie, if I go to that courthouse, I'm not going down there without my pistol. And if some of these white, I won't use the curse words he used, mess with me, I'm going to shoot them. And he said, I know that's going to cause you some problems, so it's better if I not go. So that is sort of an attitude that you encountered in these rural areas. And I want to, another kind of way where it's interesting, the dynamic between us and these older people. The first family I stayed with, the patriarch of the family was 76 years old and his wife was 74. Joe and Rebecca McDonald, Louisville, Mississippi. As it happened, I went to the courthouse with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer the first time she tried to register to vote. And following that, there was a lot of violent intimidation. Night riders came through and shot up the black community. And I wound up getting arrested for that shooting because according to the mayor, who was also the justice of the peace and owned the biggest business in town and was the head of the White Citizens Council, I had done this shooting to drum up publicity for a failing voter registration campaign. So he ordered the town constable to place me under arrest. And it was really just an attempt to intimidate. So I was kept overnight and let go. But within the context of being arrested, the shotgun of the man I was staying with was taken for evidence. The mayor said he had a source he wasn't prepared to identify that said a young black man had gone to the hardware store and purchased bullets, and that had to be me. So it was all bogus, right? But the problem for Mr. McDonald, and guns are common in the South. They're used to put food on the table in poor rural communities. They're used for self-defense in various kinds of ways. Mr. McDonald not only went out to hunt to put food on the table, he also kept varmints out of the garden he and his wife had in the backyard that would eat his vegetables and things they were growing in the back. So shotgun, in this case, a small shotgun, 22 shotgun. I mean, it wasn't like a big shotgun. It was important to him. When I was released from jail, he's worried about what to do about his shotgun, without his shotgun. And that's the part of the story I wanted to tell you. Back at the McDonald home, after my release from jail, I found that Durrell, that was the mayor's name, Charles Durrell, had confiscated Joe McDonald's shotgun, using my arrest as an excuse. Mr. Joe, as we called him, worried aloud about what he would do without it. Like most of the black people in Louisville and Sunflower County, he was poor and depended on a garden in the backyard and his gun to put food on his table. Especially now, the 3 young guys were part of his household. I'd come up there with 2 guys from Jackson, Landy McNair, a student at Jackson State College, and Charles McLaurin. We told Mr. Joe that he had a right to his gun. that the U.S. Constitution gave him that right. He asked us if we were certain. Yes, we told him. And we had a history book with a copy of the Constitution in it. I went and got the book and then read the Second Amendment out loud. You see, Mr. Joe, Mac told Mr. Joe, for emphasis, that's where it says so, right in the United States Constitution. Mr. Joe told me to fold over the page I just read and then took the book from me. A little while later, we noticed that Mr. Joe was not around, and we asked his wife, Rebecca, where he was. He went to get his gun, she told us. You said it was all right. Well, we were stunned and fearful. One of the constant concerns in the violent, deep South of those days, that local people would get hurt or even killed for behavior we had encouraged. We were about to run after Mr. Joe when we heard the familiar rattle of his old truck pulling up. He was back from City Hall. We rushed outside. What happened, we asked. Mr. Joe said he had leaned into the doorway of City Hall and simply told Mayor Durrell, I come to get my gun. The mayor replied that he didn't have a right to his gun. But Mr. Joe held up the history book he had taken from us, opened it to the page he had asked me to fold over, and told the mayor, this book says I do. And that's important because Mr. Joe was 76 years old and could not read or write. So he's opening this book and telling the mayor, this book says I do, simply because we told him that the U.S. Constitution in this book gave him the right to his gun. And it speaks to the kind of relationship and interaction between the organizer and local person in the community. It was exactly the sort of action that could get a black man hurt, jailed, or killed in the Delta or anywhere else in Mississippi. Certainly Emmett Till had been murdered for less. And Durrell was such an inveterate racist that none of us could have imagined that he would easily return the shotgun. But we misjudged the mayor, Joe McDonnell, and the entire culture of guns in the Deep South. For now, as Mr. Joe stepped out of his truck, he was triumphantly raising the shotgun above his head. You see, there's a dynamic here. You know, when you're embedding yourself in the community, you're really building relationships as an organizer. And what people learn to do, depending on your manner, there's lots. I could take 2 hours running a workshop on what the dynamic is as an organizer with a community that you're trying to embed yourself in. But you can see in this story that Mr. Joe, who could not read or write, and who had never challenged a white man, a white person in authority in his entire life, in the 76 years of his life, was willing to take our word that the book he had taken from me and asked me to fold over the page was evident that the mayor could not take his gun. I'm still amazed when I think about Joe doing this, going downtown Louisville. Louisville was a little town of 1,100 people. And Sunblock County was the birthplace of the White Citizens Council. Going down to City Hall and confront this guy who's not just the mayor, but the justice of the peace. He owns the biggest business in town, which is the hardware store. He broadcasts the agricultural news on the local radio station, and he was the president of the White Citizens Council. In other words, he was a big shot. And to say, this book I'm holding up here says, you can't keep my gun. And I don't think the mayor was intimidated, but I think I talked to Charles McLaurin, who was with me in those years, about, why do you think the mayor gave Mr. McDonald this gun back? And Mac thinks, and I think I agree with him, from the mayor's point of view, that we were trouble. And any resistance he gave us at certain levels just caused more trouble. this mayor, I should say, years later, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, joined with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer in an effort to provide housing for displaced sharecroppers. And he did that because he wanted to continue being the mayor. And bottom, these guys are practical politicians.
So when I listen, and help me with this, Charlie, I'm reminded of something attributed to Bob Moses, one of our colleagues. I won't get it quite right. You will correct me. When you're in Mississippi, the rest of America doesn't seem real. When you're in the rest of America, Mississippi doesn't seem real.
That's the exact quote.
Doesn't seem real. And when I think about that amount of violence, all of this was before we agreed upon and ultimately organized the 1964 summer, bringing in all of these young people, largely white, into this violent place. Can you talk a little bit about the thinking that went into that decision and a little bit about that experience?
It was the violence that was driving the decision making around having this summer project. You know, we could not do anything really about the violence. I mean, it was supported locally by the sheriffs and the local police, and it was ignored largely by the federal government. And we were watching people who work with us, and they tend to be, again, older people, killed. And we didn't have any answer that would lead to protection for the people in these communities. And then we decided, and we had huge debates about this, we said, well, what we have to do is get the country to pay attention to Mississippi. And then, because that's what we had failed to do. Nobody was interested. I'm talking about 61, 62, 60. Nobody was interested in Mississippi. Nobody was interested in anywhere in the South, really, in the central Alabama, southwest Georgia, the Arkansas, northern Louisiana. Nobody was interested in Mississippi. And the people who controlled Mississippi had great power at the federal level. This is John Stennis, the senator. They had the seniority because they denied blacks the right to vote. So they had all of this power. So we couldn't get the country. And we decided, after much debate, that the way to get the country to pay attention to Mississippi was to bring the country's children to Mississippi and have them. And the decision is not as cynical as it sounds. It was a practical decision. A lot of us didn't like it. I was opposed to this summer project, for instance, because I felt, as organizers, we had been now for 2 or 3 years before the project trying to develop grassroots power in organization. And we were beginning to see some of that emerge, but the roots of that were very fragile. And we were afraid that all of these outsiders coming down would just trample these still very fragile. So we had huge debate about, and here you see again the importance of the relationship between organizers and local people. As a lot of us who were organizers, most of them native Mississippi, were opposed to this project, but all, I would say without exception, of the local people we worked with were very much in favor of this summer project, because from their perspective, people coming into their communities from the outside made it better, at least a little bit better, and they liked having. And Mrs. Hamer backed me into a corner and said, well, I'm glad you came down here, Charlie. What's your objection to other people come? Now, what kind of answer can I give Mrs. Hamer? You can't tell people they have a right to make decisions and take control over the decisions that affect their lives and then turn around and walk away from them when they make decisions that you don't particularly like. You have to defer to that. At least we felt we had to defer to that. So we had this project. Mainly what was driving it was this concern about what do we do about this violence that is going on in the state. And while Medgar Evers' murder in 1963 made national news, most of the violence in Mississippi did not. While James Chaney and Michael Schwerner and Mickey Schwerner, their murders made national news, most of that kind of violence, while they were searching for Mickey and James, they were coming up with bodies in the Pearl River and in the Mississippi River. And I remember arguing with reporters, well, why don't you write about that? And that's not the story. The story is James Chaney and Michael Schwerner and Andy Goodman. So we had a serious, and it's personal, because these are people we knew. These are people we were working with. And these are people who in many instances were doing things that we asked them to do, or at least encouraged them to do. So that's what leads, There are a couple of books on the Mississippi Summer Project. You can invite the authors here and they can elaborate on all the nuances of the summer project.
Let's shift, if we can, from this look back to what, in your opinion, are some of the lessons, some of the implications for today, for the movement for Black Lives. What are some of the...
I think there's, as I said, I think there's a fair amount of similarity about what the murder of Trayvon Martin pushed forward in terms of activism. Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders in Florida, where I live, BYP 100 here in North Carolina and other places. There may be 40 some odd of these organizations that roughly form the movement for Black Lives, and almost all of them have emerged since 2012. And SNCC's lesson is not so much about guns, and I think the response to violence now, today, would have to be different than the response to guns in the rural Black Belt South in the 1960s, because most of the violence, you're not really seeing Ku Klux Klan violence in Durham or, Asheville or any place, or Baltimore. You're seeing a different kind of violence, two kinds of violence. One is police violence, and the other is kind of internal violence in inner city communities that are born out of rage and desperation and alienation. So how you respond to that kind of violence necessarily is different than how you would respond to Ku Klux Klan violence. I'll read one more thing from the book to illustrate that. Hollis Watkins, who was maybe the first of the Mississippians to commit full-time to the Mississippi movement. He was a year older than me, 20. And I talk a lot, and I just want to tell you this story without going on to a full answer to your question about today, to make, and the point I want to make that I think is extremely relevant to the movement for Black Lives today, although what I'm going to read you comes from rural Mississippi, has to do with embedding yourself in local communities. Hollis says, I was living with Dave Howard and his wife. They farmed. I realized after a few days that they had a shift set up to protect me and the house. His wife took a shift and he took a shift. One shift was from dark to midnight. The other was from midnight to daybreak. Now here I was, living in their house, eating their food, and I'm sleeping all night. And this man and his wife, farmers, are up all night protecting me. At daybreak, he's in the field all day until it starts getting dark. dark. When I realized that, I told him I would take a shift. He asked me if I knew how to use a gun. I said, yes, sir, I do. We don't use them in the movement, but I know how. I was from a little place called Chisholm Mission, which is about as big as this room, named for an AME church, and had been taught as a child how to shoot. Hollis used to boast, I could strike a match with my .22, but I know how. But will you use guns, he asked. I said, if necessary, I'll use them. So he says, take a look at these and see which ones you like best. I think he was testing me. He shows me a shotgun, a 30-06, and a 30-30 Winchester rifle, which tells you the level of guns in some of these houses. As I was checking them out, he said I could have them all. Later, I told Jim Foreman, SNCC's executive director, about this, and he said, you can't do that. I said, I'm already doing it. So again, you see these relationships in these communities, and the use of guns and that kind of stuff. Holmes County, again, another violent place up in the Delta. Using guns for self-defense is not the same as using guns for self-defense against police. And if you look in the South, very little gunplay exists between police and local people. There is some. The Deacons for Defense and Justice of Louisiana, which was formed to protect nonviolent core workers, on a few occasions threatened police with gunfire, and they backed down. And of course, the Panther Party, which would form later on in Oakland, California, in their first year, challenged police with guns, and then they changed the open carry law in California without any opposition from the NRA, I might add. And they had to shift tactics. So the use of guns anyway in black resistance has always been very practical and very specific, depending on location. But the lesson for young activists today in the movement for Black Lives, in my view, has less to do with guns than it has to do with figuring out how to embed themselves in black communities. And I tell them I'm working on a book now about the movement for Black Lives, and I spend a lot of time interacting with them, particularly in Florida where I live. And I tell them all the time that I think they have a more difficult task than we had in the rural South. This movement is largely unfolding in urban arenas, which are far more complex than, say, Sunflower County, Mississippi, where I worked, or Issaquah County, Mississippi, where I worked, or Lowndes County, Alabama, where Stokely worked. I mean, they're up against something far more complex for lots of different reasons. And the question of embedding, and how do you embed yourself in, say, West Chicago communities, or, in Baltimore communities. How do you do that? I tell them all the time, I say, I can tell you anything you want to know about how to organize in Sunflower County, Mississippi, but if you ask me about the west side of Chicago, I'm not going to be a great deal of help to you. I do know certain things. You have to figure out a way to talk to people. You have to figure out a way to move in those communities representing change, and you have to be able to move in such a way that people trust you, even if they won't take the kind of action that you want them to take, or won't take it immediately. And the lesson of the Southern movement, and SNCC in particular, and I think also Southern Core, especially in Louisiana, is that we figured out how to move. I'll tell you one quick story, then we'll take some questions. At the end of a dirt road that I was staying on in Rouville, Mississippi, this lady had what today would be called a convenience store, but she was smaller. than a convenience store. And we walked down the road on a hot summer day. Mrs. Anderson was her name. She would wave us over and say something like, "It's kind of hot out here. Why don't you boys sit down right here?" She had a bench beneath a pecan tree. "And let me go inside and get you something cold to drink." And after a while, it took us a while, but we realized she never let us go in her store. And without asking her, we concluded that she was afraid if we were seen going into her store, it might result in her store being attacked. So she made this distinction between, she wanted to support us, so she made this distinction between us sitting beneath her pecan tree and us going into the store. And the thing about Mrs. Anderson was she was a gossip. So she knew everything. So she would say, "Well, Charlie, they were talking about you last night, thinking about how to get you out of town." I don't know how she knew this kind of stuff, but I assume it has something to do with the way black servitude is integrated into white life in the South, certainly. But she knew that kind of stuff, you know. You don't want to go over there because the Klan is having a meeting. And so that was how she saw her role, and we did this for weeks, and then we finally, and I consider it one of our great breakthroughs in Woolville, Mississippi. She sat us down beneath the pecan tree and then said, "Well, why don't one of you boys go in there and get yourself something cold to drink?" And it's slow, you know, it's slow. I mean, this is weeks just sitting beneath this pecan tree. I don't know that Mrs. Anderson ever tried to register to vote, but weeks just sitting underneath this pecan tree, you know, talking to her, you know, learning from her. She knew the community intimately, and that was valuable for us as organizers. Now, there must be an urban equivalent of that, but I'm not sure what it is, because I never really did any serious work above the Mason-Dixon line. But for the movement for Black Lives, which right now is in discussion and in a process of shifting, for lack of a better word, from protest to community organizing, they have to figure out in these places, Baltimore or Durham or Asheville or these complicated places, how to move in them, how to connect to people in such a way that they become an organized force for change. They have to, people, I think even in urban areas, particularly in poor communities, are expert at judging you. You know, they may not have much formal education, you know, or any money, but they know, and they take their time doing it, when you're serious and when you're not. They're expert at doing that. In the rural areas, they're used to judging the weather, they're used to judging what's dangerous, they're used to making these kinds of judgments. And I found that people are evaluating you to see, especially when in the South, when your life might be at risk, and you can't fool them by boasting about what you're going to do. They've lived through too much to be fooled by any boast about what you're going to do. I just don't think it's fast. And groups like Dream Defenders or BYP 100 or Black Lives Matter or A Million Hoodies or Asada's Daughters, all these groups who are having a discussion about the long-term work, the work beyond protesting police violence, have to figure this out. And we can help a little bit, and some of us in the movement interact with them. But the lessons for today don't revolve around guns so much. They revolve around the organizing question. What do you do on the west side of Chicago? What do you do in Baltimore? What do you do in South Central Los Angeles? And so forth. There must be questions.
Entertain questions?
Yeah, if there are questions or things you want to know that I haven't spoken to, please. Yes.
Can you think of some things that you learned from Ella Baker that were really important to you that you pass on a lot?
Yeah, there's two important things from Miss Baker, and one is that aside from her belief that the time was right for us, just the way I believe the time is right for the movement for Black Lives. First was her stress on organizing from the bottom up and not the top down. I mean, that's what she kept. Strong people don't need strong leaders, is one of her phrases. And that's definitely what stands out. And the other thing that stands out, and some of that is unfolding today in terms of the relationship between SNCC veterans and Movement for Black Lives, she had a network across the South that she had been developing since the 1940s when she was the NAACP's director of branches. So it wasn't like we just showed up in these towns and counties. There was somebody who knew Miss Baker. And she could say, well, you need to go to Amzie Moore in Cleveland, Mississippi, or E.W. Steptoe in Southwest. These are names, Mississippi names, but this is true all across the South. So when Bob goes to for Miss Baker to Mississippi that first time, voter registration wasn't on his mind, but she had told him that he needed to talk to Amzie Moore. And it was Amzie that put voter registration on the table, and because of his interaction with Bob, then goes to SNCC's second conference, which is being held in Atlanta, to press the issue of us doing voter. And what Amzie had in his head, he liked the sit-ins, but he had no interest in it. What he liked even more was that we represented young energy. And he was trying to figure out how to use this young energy for what he wanted. So when I first show up to Ruleville, I'm brought there by Amzie Moore. And he doesn't put us at the head of a protest march. He takes us, me, McLaurin, and Landy McNair, to the Mount Galilee Missionary Baptist Church and on a Sunday, and he stands us up in the church and announces that he's brought some Freedom Riders to town. Then he hands us over to an elderly couple and goes back home and leaves us. But see, this is Miss Baker. This is Miss Baker's style. This, you have to connect, and you have to figure out how to do it honestly with people at the grassroots. You have to build your movement from the bottom up, or else you won't get anywhere. That's what still to this day, and even now, when I talk to the Movement for Black Lives people, I repeat what I learned. The other thing I should say about Miss Baker, he says it's easy to become trapped by fame and prominence. And you have to be careful when you start to attract the kind of attention that brings fame and prominence. I have in one of my books, I think it's the Bob Moses book, the actual quote. I use a lot of Miss Baker's quotes in my books, usually her talking to us. I think I have that quote, but summarizing it is you have to be careful not to get trapped by fame and prominence and think the movement cannot exist without you.
Since you didn't have cell phones and stuff like that, and needing to cover a whole state, how did you stay in touch with each other and make decisions?
I'm envious of the activists today with all that stuff.
We had put in, there
The
was
Watts
Watts line, wide area telephone service, but we also had a network, a guy named Morty Schiff out in New York set up a network of like shortwave radios.
But that's later.
And well, that was but 64, even by 64. So yes, it's not 62, but it supplemented this Watts line. But again, where I was in Amite County, one family had a telephone.
Yeah.
So accessing phones, seeking exchange of any information was dependent. Could we get to the Simmons family safely? because they were the one black family in any county.
That was the problem with phones, though, in these rural communities. Not so much tap, but they were party lines. I don't know whether that phrase exists today. So everybody's on the same line. So if you call anybody in town, you can pick up the phone and hear your conversation. I mean, that's just, these are rural, this is the rural South. So, I mean, mainly we did phones. We didn't do a lot of letter writing. I wrote Carol a letter once. But a lot of face-to-face contact. We saw each other a lot, talked to each other, and things happened, and sometimes we'd go somewhere to help out and stuff. And then we had reports. We wrote more reports of our field work than any other civil rights organization working in the South. That's Jim Foreman was the executive secretary, and he was older than we were. He was older than Martin Luther King, and he was a trained historian. And Jim would always be after us. I can hear him now saying, "Write it down." And we did. We wrote weekly reports. This is what is happening in such and such a place, where I am, or something like that. And, a much more limited form of communication than social media today. And then, of course, our conferences, we exchanged a lot of information. But the South was fairly small. You could hear what was going on in Amite County or Southwest Georgia or the Arkansas Delta fairly quickly.
How would you answer the question to young people, what is the most direct route to real change?
I don't know that there is a direct route to real change, firstly. I mean, my experience is that change unfolds awkwardly. You take 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, and it unfolds slowly. And part of it is that you're learning as you're effecting change. You try something. A lot of the movement in the South, seems to me, was experimenting with what would work. Well, let's try this. For instance, we organized, it didn't work, but we organized a Mississippi Freedom Labor Union among sharecroppers for decent, what you might expect, decent wages and the like. It made sense at first. And sharecroppers on some of the plantations went out on strike. What we hadn't factored in was how rapidly the cotton fields were mechanizing. We didn't need the sharecroppers. So if they went out on strike, what it did was accelerate the use of mechanical cotton pickers and mechanical. So if you go to the Delta now, for instance, it doesn't look at all like it looked when I first went to the place. You don't see any people, except a few people maybe driving tractors or checking on irrigation systems. So it was an experiment that didn't work. On the other hand, freedom schools were an experiment that worked in the sense of participation. So a lot of the and change is structured by trying things. You can't possibly know everything that's going to lead to change. So you have to, one of the things that characterizes SNCC in particular, and I think the Southern movement in general, is people are constantly trying things. Well, let's see if this will work. Let's see if that'll work. And let's see what the community, and communities are not of a single mind about what works. We found there were people who would respond to you about trying to register to vote. And there were a lot of people who wouldn't respond to that, but would respond to something else we organized, a Poor People's Corporation, and basically co-ops in which you try and do. So you're doing two things, trying to see what works in terms of the system you're challenging, and then what works in terms of engaging the people among whom you're living. And you can't know everything in advance about them. And I think that's as true today in the west side of Chicago as it was for me or Carol in Amite County, Mississippi, or Sunflower County, Mississippi, or Greenville, Mississippi. And you have to, and that's the hard thing for young people, is being patient. Because you want it, you want to take it, And it's not to say you can't be aggressive, but it's just you have to recognize what's real is this problem we have is enormous. And there's no way you can deal with all of it right away. Yeah.
So you've said that you don't think the main takeaway from your experience is about guns, and yet you did write a book that is premised on challenging an orthodoxy, or maybe even mythology, about what the civil rights movement was and what nonviolence meant for people doing the work. So I guess I'm curious about what motivated you to write that story and to set the record straight. And what is it that's dangerous about the version of the civil rights movement and nonviolence that has been perhaps a bit sanitized and is kind of like the official version maybe that you're writing against, that many of us learned in school or have encountered through media?
I have a huge problem, and this existed long before this book came out. I have a huge problem with the historiography with regard to the Southern freedom movement, because it's really defined as mass protest in public spaces led by charismatic leaders. Or Julian Bond used to say, the public understanding of the movement can be boiled down to three short sentences. Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and then the white folks saw the light and saved the day. So I have a huge problem with the historiography, and I feel that it's told from the top down, iconic figures, etc., event-driven as opposed to people-driven. So long before this book, I've written other books, and all of them push forward this idea that you have to approach, for real understanding of the movement, let's look at it from the inside out. And let's look at how it unfolded at the grassroots. And I've tried to write about that. And now one of the big mythologies of the movement revolves around nonviolence. And the problem doesn't lie with whether or not you believe or agree with nonviolence as a philosophical approach to life or not. That's not the problem. The problem is, if you want to talk about the ordinary communities that drove the movement, which means you're talking about the rural South, nonviolence just isn't what describes these communities. It's not what describes these people. I know people, I can think of people who are cleaning their guns saying they're part of the nonviolent movement. So it doesn't describe. It's wrong. Not wrong. It's inaccurate to just take that simple approach, or the approach that there's a dichotomy between nonviolence and armed self-defense, because that's not the way life unfolded in the South that I'm familiar with. And because nonviolence plays, and this is a writer's choice now, because nonviolence plays such a prominent role in what might be called civil rights movement canon, I decided to write something that undermined that canon. I mean, some of that has to do with my own experience, but some of it was the writer's choice. And I say, well, I don't have to write like everybody else about the movement, because I know Hartman Turnbull or E.W. Steptoe, where you live, and all these people and and their guns. Carol might want to say something about learning how to shoot a .45 on Mr. Steptoe's farm, but but I know there's a more complex and a richer story when you start to look at ordinary people in communities and how they responded to terrorism, intimidation, and there's a whole history that goes back well before the 60s movement, all the way back to the days of slave revolts, not to mention the Reconstruction era in the United States. I mean, there's a whole, it's not like this tradition of self-defense was somehow invented in the 1960s. It goes all the way back to the earliest days of this country, which is why gun controls laws were first written to keep guns out of the hands of Africans and Native Americans. So that's sort of where I was coming from. And, I thought it was a good story to tell. And again, it's the writer part of me kicking in, There's a question back here.
You addressed this a little bit, but with gun control being such a hot topic right now, I'm curious about what you think of the gun control movement's current trajectory. Just as a little aside, Cobb mentions suicide in his answer. It is not a graphic mention, but if you don't want to hear it, just skip ahead approximately 4.5 minutes.
I came here from the University of Rochester, where I gave a long lecture about this. As you ask the question, I'm trying to figure out in my mind how to shrink what was a 15-page presentation. I think this, and this is what shocks people most, I don't think that guns are central to gun violence. I don't think that at all. I think, yes, there are a range of useful, common sense ideas about controlling guns. I could tick off a half a dozen that I myself would prefer. But if you talk about gun violence, Parkland notwithstanding, or any of these places notwithstanding, something else is at play here, and I want to duck the mental health issue because in some ways that's a cop-out. But something I think that myself, violence is at the core of the country's culture. I think guns are uniquely romanticized in this country in a way that they're not in any other nation in the world. I mean, in this country, guns, when it comes to the seizure of the lands of Native Americans, for instance, or when it comes to movies, gangster films, and you see how Bonnie and Clyde or Al Capone are romanticized, even though they're killers. Or if you look at virtual reality, Xbox, and the kinds of games you can play. Violence runs deep in the culture, as Rat Brown, SNCC's fifth chairman, said in '67, violence is as American as cherry pie. So that's where the problem is centered. Now, I'm not sure what to do, because how do you change then a culture? It's not AR-15s, although I take this as somebody where I just was, and we were talking at the University of Rochester, and he called the AR-15 the male Barbie doll. But if you're looking at violence in the country, I think you have to look at specific communities. There's a lot of violence in black and brown, the poorest of black and brown inner city communities, and centered on rage and alienation. Some years back, I heard Louis Farrakhan, head of the Nation of Islam, speak, and he said a line that still sticks with me. He said, if you create a jungle, don't be surprised if there's predators in it. I think that what we're up against if you want to talk about gun violence. And I'm surprised there isn't more, given that there are over 300 million guns in private hands. There are about a little over 30,000 gun deaths annually. About half of those are suicides. And relative to the number, that's a large number, horrifying number, but relative to 300 million plus guns, not a large number. So I think something is at play here that needs more exploration than trying to ban AR-15s or automatic weapons and the like. I'm for it, fine, but I don't kid myself about what's at play when you're looking at gun violence, why somebody, and I know issues of race and class and geography, cause a lot, if not, I think most of the gun violence is taking place in the poorest of inner city black and brown communities. And I don't subscribe to the notion of black on black violence because I don't use white on white violence. It's white would have black on black violence. But, and just one number. I mean, about, this is from the Centers for Disease Control, about 10% of gun deaths, homicidal gun deaths, is the number for white communities in this country. And it's 82% for black communities. And it's ironic because exactly the reverse is true when it comes to suicides. The suicide number in black communities is very low and very high. And these are children we're talking about. This is the age group between 18 and 25. So what's at play here? I mean, I don't think that the gun discussion so far is very serious. I don't think of it as being serious. Although, just the way I try and remain optimistic. So I say, I was watching the Parkland protests in Washington, and I say, just the way, the sit-in movement that erupted on February 1, 1960, led to something larger than simply desegregation of lunch counters, but really leads the way into a cultural shift in the country. Maybe this eruption of protests around gun violence that these high school kids are doing, along with the movement for Black Lives, might be leading to a cultural shift in the country that reduces the kind of violence that exists in the country. I'm not clear on that yet. Haven't made up my mind about that yet, and I also know that even though they're high school kids, there's already a serious campaign to undermine them, to disparage them. I mean, a very serious campaign by very powerful organizations, and that puts a question mark over these efforts too. That's the gun discussion. It's there's gun violence, there's gun violence. I just don't think, I think it's fair enough if you want to talk about gun control, but I don't think you should attribute gun violence to gun possession. And I know that's a complicated idea, but that's because my whole experience in the South says that it makes a difference to who's got the gun and how they're using the gun. Does the Ku Klux Klan have it, or does E.W. Steptoe have it? Down in Amite County, it makes a difference. If I want to understand the kind of violence in the movement, should I focus on the guns, or should I focus on the Klan and E.W. Steptoe's leadership in Amite County, Mississippi?
And let us just thank you in particular and Firestorm for allowing us to come into this space and be part of this kind of conversation.
The Final Straw is a proud member of Channel Zero Network of Anarchist Podcasts, found at channelzeronetwork.com. And here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hi, my name's Eamon Farrelly, and I have a podcast. How original, right? It's called Radical People, and it's about radical people. Basically, I sit down and I interview people who I find very interesting. Interesting why? Interesting because they took a look at the world around them, saw a need, saw a problem perhaps, and they decided to address that need or fix that problem. How? With direct action. That's right, not by begging the dirty government and its politicians and bureaucrats, and not by lobbying corporations to please, please, please stop being so awful. No, they get together with some comrades or some homies or just whoever, and they implement whatever solution they see fit, however they see fit to do it. So, that's my podcast. I listen to these people's stories, which turn out to be sometimes very funny, sometimes very scary, sometimes harrowing, always edifying, sometimes titillating. Actually, I haven't had one yet that's been titillating. I know, like, making things a little sexed up generally sells, but typically when people are, those are ISIS soldiers, it doesn't get as sexy as you think. Or maybe it does, and they just haven't told me that part yet. So anyway, you should listen to my podcast if you just happen to be really bored, or on a road trip, or you just need to drown out what's going on around you. Check out Radical People by searching for it on iTunes, SoundCloud, or by checking out the Channel Zero Network. So yeah, that's my commercial for my show. Thank you for listening to my commercial for my show.
And when we die, we will die with our hearts unbound.
And now for some announcements. There's a call from a variety of groups to make some noise for the upcoming prison strike, kicking off on August 21st, 2018, which we talked about in the last episode. This is a challenge to every anarchist, abolitionist, rebel, and determined fighter against prison society and white supremacy in America. Here it goes, quote, "Between Monday, July 16th and Saturday, July 21st, we are calling on you to help unleash a concerted and spectacular array of solidarity actions before the upcoming prison strikes. Prepare now, bring mayhem everywhere. As you likely know, prisoners will strike from August 21st to September 9th. They anticipate guards and administrators to respond with violent reprisals, media distortions, and extended lockdowns. Defending the strikes from outside is an essential component of its success. Don't wait. Retaliation has already started, and as August 21st approaches, we expect to see transfers, preemptive lockdowns, and more. Outside support efforts in collaboration with imprisoned rebels have already begun. Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, IWOC, and other organizations are building phone trees, publishing call-outs, and mounting pressure campaigns. Another thing outside supporters can do is to promote and set a stage for the strike. From July 16th to 21st, we want to make an opening act that warms the public consciousness and media landscape. If we're successful, it will also be a loudspeaker for the prisoner's call, blaring it past the censors, the mailroom pigs, and the dense walls of isolation and silence that prevent prisoners from knowing what's cooking in other states or other facilities until it's already served up cold. The challenge before us is to do things so spectacular, creative, and unexpected that the mainstream media cannot neglect them. Hashtag Prison Strike 2018. Use any means necessary to break that media blockade. Take to the streets, paint the town, disrupt the status quo, hack a site, get things lit, and go ahead and chuck your anarchist purity. Resort to wooing celebrity endorsements, buying clever ads, or schmoozing your way into the news. Remember, the radical and independent outlets most likely to cover our activities exist mainly online. Hey, that's us. We need to leverage that coverage to force the big old media, the kind that gets into the prisons, TV, radio, print editions of newspapers, to report this news due to a fear of missing out, or FOMO. The goal? Get the phrase, nationwide prison strike, 8/21 to 9/9, printed or spoken on the largest platform so prisoners can see it and no one outside can ignore it. So get out there and surprise us. Overwhelm America's hostile media environment, and get the word into prisons, large and small, across the nation. So you can find downloadable sticker and poster graphics at supportprisonerresistance.noblogs.org. and this has been endorsed by Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, the Fire Inside Collective, Millions for Prisoners, and the People's Consortium. If you're in the Asheville area, Tuesday the 17th from 5 to 7:30 p.m. at Firestorm, Blue Ridge Anarchist Black Cross is holding an info session about the strike. There will be an introduction workshop to writing to prisoners, followed by news about the strike, propaganda to take home, and brainstorming on outreach methods we can take to get the word flowing on the outside and support those rumblings from the inside. This event is open to anyone who's interested in uplifting prisoner voices. In other prison-related news, here's an announcement about the August 23rd to 30th 6th Annual Week of Solidarity with Anarchist Prisoners, which obviously overlaps with the prison strike in the U.S. From the site solidarity.international, quote, "We're coming back with the Global Week of Solidarity with Anarchist Prisoners. Since last year, a lot has changed in our countries, but the general tendency is going in the worst direction, with more repressions applied against anarchists not only in Europe but worldwide. With this in mind, we are calling for a 6th Annual Week of Solidarity. Last year, lots of people sent us their reports from different parts of the world, and we hope that this year the tradition will grow even bigger. We need to support our comrades. Use this week to spread the information about anarchists behind bars. Don't have any prisoners in your country? Not to worry. Support prisoners from another country, in your region, or use those days to raise awareness of repression mechanisms and how anarchist communities can fight against them. Build up security culture. Support your local anarchist prisoners and fight back. And don't hesitate to continue sending your reports to tillallarefree at riseup.net. That's TILLALLAREFREE at riseup.net. Nobody is free till all are free. In another anarchist prisoner-related topic, the partner of Eric King has just suffered some major tragedies in her life and could use some economic help. She was recently in a car accident from which she is recovering, but now lacks a vehicle for her day-to-day work life, the childcare of her and Eric's 2 kids, and her weekly visitations to him in prison. On top of that, and her partner serving a sentence on which he has 5 more years, Eric's partner was also just diagnosed with thyroid cancer. If you have any extra dough you can toss to her, there's a GoFundMe page where she's soliciting donations. This can be found at gofundme.com by searching Surviving Cancer and a Car Accident. In other anarchist prisoner news, to check in about last week's Ask About Sean Swain's Condition, we have yet to hear anything back from Sean, the prisoner who has, for the last 4 years, been doing a regular weekly segment on our radio show. Sean had been missing from the ODRC database of prisoners and not showing up as a transfer to another prison through the Interstate Transit website. But the day after last week's episode of our show, it was brought to our attention that Sean was now back in Ohio's database's website. Anyone with clues about Sean's condition and state of being, because he's still not calling out, please drop us a line at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. If you'd like to hear us on your local airwaves, contact your community radio station and direct them to the website thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. We there feature a radio tab that if you click that, there's instructions about how to subscribe to our free, FCC-safe, weekly 59-minute long anarchist radio show. It's free, it's consistent, we get some awesome guests, we have really critical viewpoints that are really important for this media landscape. And especially, it's one thing for people to listen to our podcast, to choose to seek it out, which is wonderful. But it's another thing to actually get it up into the airwaves, where someone randomly driving past the radio station could hear it, someone could tune in at their house, someone could tune in at their jail cell, someone could, who knows? There are so many more possibilities with radio. So if you want to see this as a possibility, maybe to underpin and help promote anarchist ideas in your community, you can also hit us up. Send us an email, and we can try to work through what might work to get us on your airwaves. If you like the podcast, share it with someone. We want to spread these voices and their messages far and wide. Also, you can upvote us in the iTunes library to extend our reach. You can also find our stuff up on Twitter, Fedbook, Instagram, Mastodon, YouTube, and Reddit. Plus, our most recent show is always up at SoundCloud. Finally, if you appreciate the work that we do to bring you over an hour of anarchistic interviews and presentations each week, and have some cash burning a hole in your pocket, feel free to make a one-time donation via PayPal or a recurring one via LiberaPay or Patreon. Plus, on Patreon, there are some great thank you gifts available, and we can work something out if you're donating via a different method. You could be the first person in your state or country to be looking good in a Final Straw t-shirt, or you could grab up some buttons and stickers. Check it out. If you visit our website and click the donation page, you'll find the necessary links and the easy instructions. All of our content is free, but even as little as $1 can help us to pay for the costs of operations. Thank you so much.